Welcome to our podcast. My name is Tom Charity. I'm one of the year-round programming team of the Vancouver International Film Festival, and we're recording this on day 5 of the festival on the lands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And our guest here today is Atom Egoyan, one of Canada's premier filmmakers, and also experienced and celebrated director of opera. Mm-hmm. And these two interests combine in Atom's latest film, Seven Veils. Welcome, Atom.
Nice to be here.
I'm assuming that the inspiration for the film came about when you were invited to remount Salome again. Is that correct?
Yes, I originally presented it in the mid-90s, 96, and actually here at Vancouver Opera as well, right around the time that we were actually prepping Sweet Hereafter. So I've remounted it several times since those first productions. And when I found out that it was being remounted in 2023, it just raised a number of issues. It felt that the opera, that production, was of its time in the mid-90s. It's quite provocative, and there's some very extreme imagery in the opera, which I felt could not really be presented to a public now without trigger warnings and all sorts of other things that we have come to arm ourselves with when it comes to viewing disturbing work or unsettling work. But then I also began to think about whether or not it might not be better to have someone else to direct it and have their own interpretation. Now, the reality is, because of the cost of opera, that's not as easy to do as one may think. It's to commission a new interpretation is beyond the budget of an opera company, especially in these very strained times. So I understood why they were remounting this, but I had a fantasy that someone else could actually present it. And that really was the inspiration for this. Who would that person be? And why would they have a relationship to this piece? So I began to think about, I went very personal, and I thought about Exotica, and I thought about Sweet Hereafter, and how those two films were inspired by this individual in my life. And I imagine someone like her being able to take back something that had been inspired by her experience and reclaim it in a way. Pretty tall order, but it felt very urgent to me, and I began to write this scenario, this script, and I thought it could piggyback with the actual production of Salome earlier this year. It was in January that we were rehearsing, and that while it was still on stage in Toronto at the Canadian Opera Company, I could shoot this film. Anyway,
that sounds easy.
It was so difficult. It was a really, really difficult thing. It fell apart at one point, and then my old friend Neve Fishman at Rhombus Media came involved, and then I had this idea of approaching Amanda Seyfried, who was in Chloe, and maybe that there would be a commercial way that it could be the budget might be raised. And so it was piecemeal, but we managed to actually shoot it while the opera was still on stage in Toronto, which was a miracle. I must say, it was a miracle. We shot it in 19 days, and so we have the film. I mean, this is what we're presenting here at the Vancouver Film Festival. Just after its premiere at the Canadian Opera Company, we converted the Opera House into a cinema during the Toronto Film Festival. And then I had a really wonderful screening last night at the Vancouver Playhouse, because I had presented an original opera there in the 90s as well. And the composer, Rodney Sharman, was there last night. So, as well as Judith Forst, the Canadian opera singer who actually was in one of the iterations of Salome, playing Salome's mother, Herodias. So it was a really wonderful evening, and it But it's still, I suppose, for all the ambitions of the film, it still ultimately is this male chain of people interpreting the story of Salome. And what the film is trying to present is that it's possible for there be a break in that chain, that you have a woman who is able to then imagine the story in her own terms. And that's Janine. That's the character played by Amanda Seyfried. So in my scenario, she's remounting the show. And my character, who I'm not Charles, but Charles in the film is the person who originally mounted the show, and he's passed away, and he's put in his will that if it's ever remounted, he wants his former student to remount the show. And we begin to understand that they had a very complex relationship, and how he appropriated elements of her own history for the show, which might have been exciting for her at the time, but now she's beginning to question that and beginning to wonder what her responsibility is in terms of presenting her own history, and also how vulnerable that makes her, because of course there's a chance that it may not be as powerful as what she experienced with Charles, which is disturbing, and puts her own methodology into question, because the way he got those performances may not be acceptable anymore on a Canadian stage. So she's finding that there are restrictions, and it's a very, maybe I'm not doing a good job at explaining it, but it's very complicated. There are a number of different sort of issues that the film is trying to raise.
Charles' original production of the opera in the film that we're watching was inspired by his friendship with Janine, who was abused. And so he incorporates elements of that into his production. Right. And now he's left her this gift, dubious gift, yes, to take that on and remount. Perhaps you could explain what remounting an opera is, because that's something that I only learned from the film.
Well, it's basically taking looking at a videotape now and looking at the stage manager's direction for what the blocking was on stage. That is how the singers were moving in this set, and really putting it back on its feet. There isn't much space for reinterpretation, because the set and the props are all what they are. So you can make minor changes, but you can't really do anything that's going to affect the set, and you don't have time. You have much less time than when you're doing an original production.
But specifically, how long would you have had when you mounted the original production of Salome?
Well, in the original production, you have time with the designer, so that you're able to come up with a concept, and then the designer will make a model and present that, and it will be budgeted out, and there'll be costumes. Everything is budgeted out so that we know what the costs are. And so that's quite an investment that the opera company is making. Now, in this case, it did very well for the Canadian Opera Company, because it's been remounted in several places. So they've been able to recoup that investment. But for the most part, and since it has been a successful show, there's a very good chance that this production of Salome will be remounted by the Canadian Opera Company in 10 years into the future, which is strange, but that's just how it is. So when you remount, you have much less time. In Europe, particularly in Germany, you have like maybe a week to 10 days to put it back on its feet. So it's very, very speedy. Here we have a bit more time. We have maybe 2 to 3 weeks, but it's not like the time that you have to think about a concept and develop that and rehearse that with your singers.
So it's really a question of bringing the cast and the crew up to speed on what pre-exists.
Right. So what Janine is doing, though, is she is trying within that space to make these changes and to reconfigure and to explore what it meant to have witnessed Charles interpret her history, while at the same time trying to reconfigure that and reformat it as to what her needs are now. And also what might have been enthralling for her in her early 20s is very different now that Charles has passed, and now that she's dealing with the mechanics of the actual opera house and their own agenda, right? So she's actually she's told quite specifically, quite early on in the film, that they're concerned about changes that she mentions in her opening introduction at a press conference. So she goes into it already thinking about the fact that there are things she wants to alter, but then it becomes manifest during the production method, and actually she's challenged on that. But we gather that those changes actually were allowed. I mean, she's never actually stopped, and but we're not sure at a certain point of what she's imagining and what's actually happening, I suppose. There is kind of a psychic break at some point. So, and there's a very specific moment in the film when that happens. So as to what it is we're seeing, it might be what she's imagining is being presented on stage. We're not quite sure of that.
Mm. I'd like to take us back to the original invitation to put on the opera. This was the first time you'd been asked to do something like that, right? Why did they come to you, and why were you interested?
Well, that's a very lovely story, because in fact Niamh Fishman, who ended up co-producing the film with me, was on the board of the Canadian Opera Company at the time, and he had suggested to Richard Bradshaw, who is the artistic director, that he might want to see my films and that there might be a connection there. And what Richard didn't know was that I come from theater. That was my first passion, was writing and directing my plays. But I'd stopped doing that for a while. So Richard saw Exotica and felt that the person who made that film would really respond to Salome with its themes of repressed desire and what happens when the gaze is not returned, and all these sorts of issues that Wilde, Oscar Wilde, who wrote the original play that the libretto is based on, was obsessed with many of the issues that I was really excited about at that time. So it was a good fit.
And sexy dancing.
And sexy dancing, of course. No schoolgirl uniforms in this production, but certainly, yes, sexy dancing. Yeah.
And from your point of view, I mean, obviously, it's very flattering.
Sorry, I have to. For the people who may not know, I'm making a reference to Exotica. I'm not just saying that. I'm not just saying that flippantly.
Yes, I'm glad you threw that in.
Yes, because if someone is just listening to this, they wouldn't know what I was talking about, and that might sound really outrageous. But yes,
of course, the Dance of the Seven Veils.
Yes, but in the Dance of the Seven Veils. But in Exotica, there is also a very performative aspect in a strip club where Mia Kirshner's character is. I won't get into the details of that film, but I wasn't just being flippant. Yes.
So you were, I'm sure, flattered to be invited, but you also felt that there were affinities there.
Yes, I did, and I think that I've come to believe that I think Salome is a really important piece of text by Oscar Wilde. Now, it's fiendishly difficult to perform because, unlike his other plays, which are very witty and which are well-made plays, this is it's very purple. The prose it's overwrought, and it's very difficult to perform it without some take. So, you have I think a very successful production that Stephen Burkhoff did, where the language is slowed down and everything is stylized in some way, because you can't just present it as it is. It's very unwieldy. But Richard Strauss saw a production directed by none other than Max Reinhardt, actually, in Germany, and it excited him. He saw something in that production, which is lost to us, of course, but which he felt would make a great libretto. What that means is that a composer sees a piece of drama and thinks musically, thinks of how they can respond to that, and so that some of the most exciting operas are based on that encounter with an existing play. So this is certainly one of them, and it's a piece that revolutionized music theater. There's a very famous book by Alex Ross called The Rest is Noise, which is looking at the evolution of 20th century music. And really, this is how the book starts, is the premiere of Salome. It's not that the opera is ever atonal, but what it's doing is it's using sonorities, and it's making these chromatic sort of shifts as it tries to illustrate every image that the characters are referring to. So it's not extending these motifs. It's almost like just responding word by word to what the singers are actually uttering. And so it, by nature, is incredibly overwrought. And he finds a way musically to respond to Wilde's text. So that fevered sort of sense that the opera is able to conjure, it's really quite a unique and heady sort of mix. It's just a really crazy brew. But I do think that the story is coming from Oscar Wilde dealing with his own inability to express his sexuality freely at that time. And so what happens when desire is sublimated? What happens when it's not allowed to express itself, and how does it what's the result of that? And of course, we know what happened to Oscar Wilde as a result of that. That there is a violent response, and in Salome, it's the most violent response, right? When she can't have what she wants, which is to kiss the lips of John the Baptist, she dances this sexy dance, and actually ask her stepfather Herod to behead John so that she can finally kiss his lips. So that's one of the most famous scenes in opera, is Salome kissing the severed head.
Yes, that's it's quite the image.
Yeah.
In directing opera, I can't think of almost a form more different from directing movies. As an outsider, and having seen, I'm not hugely well versed in the opera world, but having seen several operas, there's a lot of standing still. There's a lot of repetition by nature in the singing, and so it tends to be almost static tableau, and then finding movement within that. So that seems like a huge transition. Do you remember how you tackled that back then?
Well, it's interesting. I do think that this question of characters being still is something that I have explored in the films as well. Like, there are spaces, and there is a rhythm to the films where there is a static, almost stilted nature sometimes, that where the characters are aware of this performative aspect of their own personalities. So I'm coming in my own films from this space where, unlike the realist tradition of cinema, and which is an incredibly rich tradition, and in this country, there's a series of docudramas that have been made, and obviously you have the British tradition of the Ken Loach and Mike Leigh and Dardenne brothers, and there's a very rich understanding that cinema can represent reality. But I'm drawn to these filmmakers perhaps who are challenging that a little bit, and who are coming from another space where there is some way that they're understanding the question of representation. Now, that could be someone like Bresson, who's using non-actors. So there's something not awkward, but there's something fragile about what we're seeing on screen, and we're trying to understand that, and that also translates into, like so many filmmakers that I have been inspired by. I think Bergman does that as well, coming from a theatrical tradition. Fassbinder certainly coming from a theatrical tradition. That they're trying to engage with the construction of what that character feels about their own identity. So in the early films, like A Family Viewing, say, there's this a character might feel that they're in a soap opera. So the film is actually shot as a soap opera with live switching and canned laughter being imposed on the dialogue, right? So as a viewer, you're immersed in this, and you have to navigate your way through. You have to try and understand why that's being presented that way. Now, you might react against it and just feel it's unbearable, or you might engage with it, and it might be exciting. But if it is exciting, it's because you're making something of a theatrical leap. You're looking at you're aware of the artifice, and you're actually choosing to engage with it through something you're projecting. So it is a split in cinema, right? I do feel like there are these two traditions, and you can't say one is better than the other. They're just different aspects. But I do believe that some of the filmmakers who go into this more, for lack of a better word, perhaps self-conscious idea of their image making are coming from a theatrical background. They've had some relationship to the theater. Alain Resnais is another good example. Who is actually, in his latter films, actually using theater quite explicitly. So, but that informs his early masterpieces as well, like L'année dernière, Marienbad, last year at Marienbad, or at Hiroshima Mon Amour. There's this idea that you're very aware of the construction of narrative.
Mm-hmm. Your production of the opera, as I understand it, was radical, especially in the presentation of the Dance of the Seven Veils.
Yes, I've come to understand that now. Like, I wasn't aware of it at the time, but I do think someone sent me someone had written an academic article, but I think it might have been the first time where those 8 minutes of music were used as a sort of flashback. So in this production, Salome sits on a swing, and when the dance starts, the swing is lifted and her skirt unfurls, becomes a screen. And so we then use that music to go into her past. So I believe other productions have explored that idea, but this might have been the first. I think it was the first. I mean, again, I'm only basing that on what someone else's sort of... But there have been, in opera, like Alban Berg famously, in Lulu, there is a scene that is scored for film. So even though that's an unfinished opera, the director is invited to use film in that moment. So it's not a new idea, but I think it was new in '96 to do that with the Dance of the Seven Veils.
And your inspiration for that choice was, I guess, to move away from the lascivious set piece, which, we might know from, a Cecil B. DeMille movie. Mm-hmm. And instead, we have a more psychological understanding of the character of Salome, right?
Yeah. I mean, it also is born out of one of the reasons why I could take this approach with my production at the Canadian Opera Company in '96 is there was an existing production of Salome, which had been used for maybe decades. I'm not sure how old it was, but I remember watching it. And there is this question of what's going to happen for 8 minutes. Like, is that singer going to actually dance for 8 minutes? And if they're not a dancer, that becomes really torturous in a way. Like, to see someone who's not comfortable with their body, perhaps having to dance for 8 minutes is really... And I witnessed that, and I remember it being a huge block. Well, what do we do? Now, in fact, some of the Salomes that I've had in these productions have been dancers. There's an English singer, Helen Fielding, who's a very good dancer as well. And so I've had some singers who are able to perform aspects of the dance. But I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we actually used a silhouette so we could have a real dancer? And then from that came this idea, well, if we have a screen and we're using a silhouette, then we can project other things on that screen. And so it wasn't this aha moment where suddenly, it will be a film, but it went through various stages. So in the same way, Janine goes through these different stages as she evolves. And again, it's a little compressed because the idea that she would have these ideas within this 2-week or 3-week period that she has, but there it is within the realm of possibility. There has to have been some buy-in on the part of the opera company to allow her to do that, but she gets to, or she imagines that she gets to, and that's what we're presented with in the film.
Yeah. So, but the imagery that's shown on the screen is kind of a flashback to explain that she's been abused.
Yes. Now, as to what the extent of that abuse was, I mean, it would be, it's left murky, but we do see a moment where her father allows her to fall in front of his camera, and that, to me, like, that crosses the line. I mean, if you are prepared to kind of anyway, I don't want to give it away. So it could be a gateway to other types of, but we don't know. As she says it at one point, like, what Charles has done with that story is not how it happened, as she says in the film. But we don't know what actually happened. We don't know what elements are true, and I think that blurriness is part of what I'm presenting, because there's this question that the film positions, which is, yes, she was certainly traumatized as a child by that abuse, but is she also re-traumatized by what Charles does in visualizing and presenting that through his own interpretation, and now is she like triply traumatized by the idea that she has to remount that, and it may not achieve the tone or the specific feeling that Charles was able to muster for his production because of techniques that she doesn't have access to anymore because of the way that relationship to performers has changed. We're living in a time of intimacy coaches, and directors don't get to do what they used to do. Now, we see certain scenes in the film during the rehearsal process where she certainly crosses that line herself. And so that's part of the strange skewed humor of the piece, depending on how you look at it, because it's just taking this odd view of, she's not following a traditional kind of hero's journey here, right? I mean, she's flawed, and she's obviously, perhaps as a result of the way she's been victimized, she's not beyond using some of those techniques herself in the rehearsal process. So that's kind of the darker side of, what it's also examining as well, which is that you can't just escape, trauma that easily. It actually reflects your own behavior. And so that makes it odd for the viewer to actually position themselves in terms of Janine sometimes. I will say that also she's not being supported at all by the people around her. And there's a number of relationships with various men and women, and they all seem to have their own agendas and their own desire of how she should be acting or behaving. And so she's quite lonely. Even the person who adores her is sort of infatuated with her, and so sort of seeing her through the gaze of that infatuation, so it's not really seeing her. So the only people who are really with her are us, the viewer, which puts us in an odd position as well. Yeah, I mean, look, I knew it was going to be messy and challenging, and but I sort of just threw myself into it because I really felt it was a unique opportunity, and there are a lot of balls in the air. I mean, we're only talking about Janine, but there are a number of other characters as well.
I mean, when your original production was presented, there were people uncomfortable with the direction that you'd taken, and that it was too violent. Yeah,
I mean, I did. No, and there were other issues as well that came up. I mean, it was a very controversial production, and it actually ended up, being kind of a. God, once upon a time, people used to have front page conversations about the arts. I mean, but there was a back and forth with one particular critic over something that she found particularly offensive in the show, and I I rarely respond to a critic, but this was particularly upsetting. So there was a back and forth, which was carried by a major newspaper, which, God, we can just only imagine that used to happen once upon a time.
If only.
If only. But so I was really super conscious of this as we were remounting it in 2023. This is going back to the beginning of this conversation. I was aware that, it needed to be addressed. These issues had to be addressed. And
so were the critics back then right?
well, they were right about certain things. Yes, they were right about certain things. But those particular things that I think they were right about are not in the film. They were in an early draft, because there were the characters around Herod called the Five Jews. And so yes, you can talk about Wilde's anti-Semitism as it comes up in some of his work, and you can certainly talk about Richard Strauss's anti-Semitism and how it worked into the Third Reich, because he was never a member of the party, but certainly he was still working during the Third Reich, kind of somehow managed to keep his reputation relatively unscathed after the war. So there is this very problematic scene where Strauss is actually almost using a certain type of music to make a caricature of these five Jews, and there was a critic at the National Post, Tamara Bernstein at the time, who said that the production itself was anti-Semitic, and so I was in the process of making my film Ararat at the time, which was dealing with all sorts of issues of race hatred and genocide. So the last thing I wanted to do was deal with being branded anti-Semitic. So I responded to this, and I responded to the fact that this is actually embedded in Oscar Wilde's text, and it's in the music, because the critic had said that this should actually be mothballed. This opera should not be presented anymore. So I was making the argument, well, no, it's a very important piece of music, and we have to actually have some sort of relationship to it, because you can't just ban art. But what was fascinating about that, and I felt my position was correct, and this just to be honest with you, it shows you how blinded you could be, was I was talking to my assistant director, associate director, long time. She was involved with the original production. She was involved with the remount as well. And she's been really a very good friend. And I was talking about this issue. And she said to me, right before we remounted this piece, she said, I don't know if you really understood what Tamara Bernstein found problematic. And I said, what do you mean? She goes, well, when we do this very violent scene of sexual coercion, you've staged, that those characters are actually performing this gang rape. And I went, oh, right. And that is problematic. She goes, yes, it is. And I was going, okay, I was completely blind to that, because she doesn't say that specifically, and I'm responding to something else. But I'm going, oh my God, how did I do that? And I felt that it was just convenient because it was Herod's henchman in a way. But so we completely restaged that. But I was actually a little ashamed of myself that I didn't understand what the issue was, and it probably, because the article didn't actually bring that up. Maybe she didn't completely understand as well what she found so sickening about that interpretation. So that was very, that taught me a lot. That I learned a lot from that experience of how blinded we are sometimes with a sort of an artistic idea, creative idea, but we're not actually understanding how it will be interpreted and what our responsibilities are. So that was addressed. And then in an early draft, actually this scene was in her rehearsal process. So she was actually navigating her own way through that, Janine. But then it got too messy. So we just removed that whole issue. So that scene doesn't even appear in this version of the opera. But I thought about that a lot. I thought about, how you can just be swept up in something and not see how others might react to it. I had this experience, I have to say, with a film I just saw, a Bulgarian film called Baluga's Lessons. Did you see this film? It was anyway, but there was a character in it. It's about this woman who is an intellectual in Bulgaria, and she gets involved in this phone scam, and she's elderly and she loses all of her savings, and she, it's about this extraordinary journey she's on. But she also has a side gig where she's teaching Bulgarian to recent immigrants, and there was this character who from the moment she appeared on screen, I knew she was Armenian. She looked Armenian. And sure enough, she's not only Armenian, but she's from Artsakh, which is this area that just in these past few days has been completely taken, like it's been ethnically cleansed effectively of Armenians. There's a mass exodus, which has been very troubling. But in the film, she occupies this particular position, and I really invested in her because I was really, really drawn to the film and the story. And she's trying to learn Bulgarian so she can become a citizen, so she can bring her mother from this endangered area. And I was in tears, actually, when she said where she was from. But then what happens to her in the film is just so horrifying, and it was a blow, when I won't give it away, but she's just so. It's so sad what happens to her, and I felt like, oh my God, like, does the filmmaker understand how devastating that must be to present a character who's Armenian and then treat her this way, like use her as this plot device, and this is what happens, especially after you invest, as I invested so much into her, as a beacon of hope in this very bleak film. Mm-hmm. So that was really, and then to top it all off, I was like looking up a review just to see how the film, and she's referred to as a Syrian refugee. So she's not even, like, they don't even identify that she's Armenian, and it's a major, like, review. And I'm going, oh, well, yeah, it's just, like, it could be anyone. And of course, the reviewer wasn't taking the care to understand when she says she's from Artsakh, where that is, probably, just assumed that she was Syrian. And how did we get into this? It just sort of feels to me that it's so difficult sometimes as an artist to know and to cover for all the ways your work might be interpreted. Yeah. And you are in this very there are huge expectations that are placed on you, and you are so you have to defend your work, but sometimes the criticisms that are being leveled against it are true, but you can't see that at the moment. It takes some perspective because you're just so protective. So I'm sure if I approached this Bulgarian filmmaker and I told them what my issue was, they would. I'm not sure how they would react, actually, but it's so complex. And it's so complex. Yeah.
The conversation around representation and the responsibility for that, and who owns a story, who has the right to tell a story.
Right.
That seems to be very current right now in a way that it didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago.
Yes, absolutely. And so there are moments now when we, and I certainly, when I'm approached with material that's not my own, sometimes I am asking whether or not I'm the right person to tell this story, and often feeling that I'm not, right?
And this, Charles giving Janine this handoff, right, feels in a way like it might be an attempt to make some repairs.
Yes, but it's a loaded one, right? Because it also presupposes that she has the critical distance necessary to actually go through this process, and whether or not he's inviting her to remount his show or opening up the possibility for her to reinterpret his version of it, and understanding that she won't be able to do that, also raises the possible idea that it might be a curse of sorts as well. But we don't understand enough about their relationship to know what the intricacies of that are. But it's raised, I think, and it's certainly raised in terms of Charles's widow, who now runs the opera company. Her decision to actually heed Charles's request and invite, the former mistress of her husband back to do the show, like there was an agenda there as well. Like there's a lot of balls in the air, and we're not even, again, talking about some of these other characters. So, and it's fascinating to me, like more than perhaps any film I've done. I mean, there's a wide variety of responses, and people seeing different things in terms of what's going on. So that's been interesting, and I think it's one of the times where I really don't want to answer certain questions, because people can have a very strong idea of what they're seeing and what that means, and as I'm trying to work my way through it, I think other viewers might be as well.
So this is a difficult question to ask, and you don't have to answer it, but is there a sense in which you ask yourself whether you had the right to tell a story about trauma and abuse? That's my phone.
Good timing.
Wow.
I felt that there was something in my head that was going off when you asked that. I mean, it's an interesting question, because I do feel, and it was odd, it came up in the Q&A at the Calgary Film Festival, and it was a very therapeutic and weird moment, because my whole experience is drawn from the perspective of someone during my adolescence. I was deeply in love with this young woman who, the time we were together, over 5 years, that whole time she was being abused by her father, and so she was in complete denial about it, and I sensed that there was something odd, but I had nothing to contextualize it, and certainly the community that I was raised in Victoria, BC, he was quite a prominent artist. People knew his work, and he used to often exhibit these eroticized paintings of his daughter. So it was almost, he was flaunting, this is where the relationship was, but no one wanted to talk about it at the time. It wasn't discussed. So that really has informed a lot of what I do. Like, there's this question of violation, but also I had this odd perspective where she wasn't aware that she was being victimized. I mean, she had a deep relationship with her father, and there was and she became an actress, and she ended up directing as well. She passed away from cancer, and as her father has also passed away now. But I feel like
so you can speak more freely about this than you would have when Sweet Hereafter was.
Yes. No, I never spoke about it at the time. Though we remained very close, and she was aware of those films. She came to see Exotica, and I'll never forget her reaction to Exotica, because she did go to, I'll be even more specific, she did go to a private girls' school, and that was her uniform. So I was quite meticulous about kind of reconstructing that, and she was shocked by that, but also, so, God, these things are so complicated, but I do feel like I have questioned, like, especially since she began to direct herself. She never became a filmmaker, but she was directing some really interesting theater. And I will go so far as to say she wrote a play which was dealing with this, and it was presented, and it wasn't well received, actually, which was like shocking in a way, because it's not as though her decision to then deal with her own history would automatically produce the most coherent piece of work either, right? So there's this question of like, well, am I also, have I appropriated her own history? But I think part of my history was also what I observed. So I do think that what I think Sweet Hereafter presents, which makes it quite unique, is that it's showing what that type of abuse might feel like to someone who has not quite absorbed the violence that's been done against them. So Sarah Polley's character, there's this weird, creepy lyricism in that film as she's trying to place the way her father is behaving in this context of a line that's been crossed. But she doesn't really understand how violent that is until this moment in the film when the father actually rejects her. Troubling. And it's very different from the novel. If you read the novel, Nicole in the novel is enraged from the beginning. She's trying to get back at the father in some way. But when I did the the interpretation, I shifted it to what I had seen. And I wanted to see if it was possible to use cinema to create this space which showed how a victim is trying to process it as it's happening, and when they're still in limbo as to what their own relationship to this abuse is. So when I got the invitation to do Salome, between these two films, which are dealing with it quite discreetly, Exotica and Sweet Hereafter, I thought, okay, well, let's just look at it just from the most brutal, violent, using the music. Forget about the subtleties of what this is. This leads to this incredible psychic break from reality, and where, the character of Salome, does something completely irrational and crazed and inexplicably violent. But in fact, there is an explanation that when violence is done against you, then you react with violence. And certainly that's what happens with Janine in the film as well. That when abuse, when you feel that you have been abused, then it's very difficult to break that cycle. It's really difficult to break that cycle because it informs the way you see other human beings. It becomes foundational. So the film is exploring some of that. I don't even know if I had, because your phone went off so beautifully as you were asking the question, and I actually had a moment where I was thinking that was my brain making that noise. So it was odd when I saw you extract your cell phone.
I think the question was about whether you had the right, and I think you've addressed that. But let's perhaps, tweak that a little and talk about whether, I feel like by nature, art, there's something vampiric about being an artist, and that you do feed on others. There is an element of exploitation inherent in the practice of art almost across all disciplines. And there's something in the culture today which is, questioning that, but also in a somewhat puritanical way, or certainly an idealistic way.
Yes. So I had an issue with this production where, as I've had in several things I've seen, where there are trigger warnings, because actually that's what art does. It does trigger these feelings. And so this Bulgarian film that I mentioned before, if there was a trigger warning, some Armenians might be upset by this, then I wouldn't have had the reaction I had, which was a very strong reaction, and one that I'm still wrestling with. And I'm grateful to have had that reaction and not to have been warned specifically that this might upset me for that reason. We are living in a time where, and I refuse to actually say whether or not this is right or wrong. I think it's a time of evolution, and there are sensitivities that we are prepared to understand and to respond to. I'm of a certain generation. I understand what the issues around that generation are. I'm not Charles, but I can't say I'm completely divorced from what that character represents, which is an era of male privilege. I'm looking at a photo of the 60th anniversary of the Cannes Film Festival, where all these directors from the Pantheon were invited to make short films which reflected on cinema. And we were all invited to the festival, and we were all on stage, and sure enough, we're all men, except for Jane Campion. So that's not so long ago, and that's wrong. So, and that's being addressed. And if that means that...
very slowly it can.
Yeah, very slowly and calm, but still, it is, and it has to be addressed. And so these things have to be refigured. And so, to answer your question, yes, I think Charles is as a dying wish, he's seeing that era has passed, and he's doing something progressive. I don't think he's willfully saying this is a curse, but the film presents what the issues around this might be. The issues being that, yes, we have to open up these opportunities, but are the artists that are being invited into these spaces at a point in their own development where they can actually take full advantage of that? Are we prepared to develop these artists and see them fail until they produce work that is stronger? Because that's part of what we need to do in the development of our creative national sort of presence. We have to let artists succeed and fail. We can't just put someone in a position and expect that they're going to have the facility. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes an artist is ready and they produce something that's brilliant. But more often than not, it needs to go through development. And so, anyway, this is a much longer conversation. But so much, like things do have to change. But we also need to understand that the artistic process is slow, and that it's not going to necessarily match the societal pressure of what it needs to be. You can't redress things immediately. So when we talk about this, it's a long-term process. These are people who have not been allowed to do their work generationally. And there is trauma involved, and there is anger involved, and all those things have to be worked out. And it takes a long time to process that.
And the processing of a work of art, a collaborative work of art, one of the things you show in Seven Veils is that is full of grey lines and messiness, and that even Janine's direction feels exploitative to some, and that there are subsidiary characters in the piece who are on the receiving end of male abuse, male exploitation, but who are themselves exploitative in return, and that this is part of human nature.
Well, it's part of justice. I mean, like if someone is, in the case of props master, who's assaulted by one of the singers, and she happens to have recorded that moment, and she takes it to the administration of the opera company, and she's expecting a degree of protection. When that's not forthcoming, then that's going to have a result. And so she's still seeking justice. And so the film actually, and it's maybe ambiguous about this and purposefully so, but as to, she doesn't go to that meeting thinking that she's going to do what she does, but she reacts when she sees how the administration behaves and decides that she's going to find her own form of restorative justice. And there's no reason to say that her form of restorative justice doesn't necessarily need to apply to any sort of norms of what that might mean to someone else. That's what she feels she needs to extract from this. So she feels she needs to extract an opportunity for her lover, her partner, to have a singing part. And she seems to have negotiated this with one of the singers, partially anyhow. So yes, it feels wrong, as her lover points out, that that's not the way to behave. But even that is actually questionable, because if her lover had accepted that, then maybe a sort of justice has been played out. But it's problematic because it feels that again, it doesn't conform to any norm, but that's okay too, because there are several ways in which justice is interpreted by different societies or different individuals, and some of them are lawful, some of them are not, and some really important films have been made by people who are pursuing non-lawful means of restoring justice. So I feel that that's within the possibility of what this character can do. And for the viewer does have to decide whether or not, anyway, it's hard to talk about the film before people, but I had this very conversation last night with a group of people who had seen the film, and I was really excited by very differing interpretations of what they had just seen, depending on their own biases, and that's okay as well. I think the moment you construct a film like this and you're using elements which are non-traditional, like the use of opera and these scenes from an opera in a film, that people are a bit liberated to they have the space to kind of be thinking about other things, which are, it's unusual perhaps in a film. The main barrier we have here is that because these people were saying, you know, I wasn't sure if I wanted to come and see the film when I read about it. And they were there for they worked for the bank that was sponsoring the evening last night. And they were like, they said they really had a strong experience. They said, I wouldn't have normally seen this film. And I asked them, well, what would have prevented you from seeing the film? It has Amanda Seyfried. It's sort of, you know, and they said, well, it's just the word opera. Like, I'm not really into opera. And I thought, okay, that's going to be our major hurdle here. Because the film does explain, you know, you don't need to know anything about this opera going into the film. And it really is explained within the film. But there is this feeling that it's an opera film, and that is our biggest barrier right now. And we've seen it from the distributors and, you know, people who responded really well. We've had a good response, but it's just, how do you get people to see it? And I don't know if I have an answer to that. Maybe you do.
Let's popularize opera.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, this is a much easier plot than most operas, right? It's sort of, actually, there's more outlandish things happening in the film that probably happen within the opera itself. But you know, because that's been the honest responses. Because I've also done Mozart, and you know, so why didn't you choose a Mozart opera? It's like, and I'm going, well, I just didn't.
That's another film.
That's another film, right? Yeah.
Thank you. I guess we should be wrapping up. What are your plans opera-wise?
Well,
what are your plans film-wise?
I have two operas coming up. One in Montreal, one back in Victoria. I had a really good experience with Pacific Opera some years ago, and that's my hometown. So I'm going back to do something in the next couple of years. So really, it's just opera right now. I am thinking about shooting something else in Armenia, because it's more possible to work on a small budget in Armenia than it is in Toronto right now. Like, this was really challenging. I hadn't shot in Toronto for a number of years. My last film was about a food inspector, but we shot that in Hamilton because we couldn't afford to shoot in Toronto. And I was rudely reminded of, like, it's just an impossible city to shoot in for a low budget filmmaker, which I still am, really, when you compare to what Netflix and all these people are spending and what the crews are expecting now. So, yeah, I'm sure it's the same in Vancouver as well.
Let's talk to Netflix as well.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Adam, for joining us.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you.
You know, I think this conversation has probably persuaded people that there is a lot to unpick in Seven Veils, and I strongly recommend the movie.